All right. Well, again, good morning. Happy Friday to each and every one of you. Thanks so much for being on today's class. We're going to be going over the essential lease disclosures. A lot of the questions I've received is, Simon, what disclosures are we supposed to provide when we represent either the landlord or the house provider or the tenant itself, right? When we start going through the motions. Now, believe it or not, even tenants and house providers must provide essential disclosure to ultimately, get the property lease, right? Now, different scenario, different situation when it comes to a real estate sales transaction, right? There's, TDS, SBQ, and other relevant disclosures. Well, in the housing providers, when it comes to renting out a place, there is also specific disclosures that both the house provider must disclose, and ultimately the tenant must respond to these disclosures, right? And it's really just anything about relevance regarding the property. What are they getting themselves into, right? If it's a lease agreement for 12 months or if it's a month to month, there's certain obligations that a house provider and a tenant must do to ultimately consume the agreement in place, right? So I am on my car forms through the California Association of Realtors. Very easy. So for me is I like to be very upfront with all of the paperwork. So if I'm representing the house provider, right, I'm already going to have a series of documentations that I'm going to be having the house provider sign, right? Or if I'm representing the tenant, right, there's certain documentations that I'm going to have the tenant sign, right? And once we find and identify a property that they want to submit an application, then that's when the ball starts rolling, right? So for today's lecture, I'm going to kind of dive into the responsibility from a house provider, right? So you go to new, right? And I usually go to the classic. I'm still not too accustomed to the new platform. So you go to the classic as an example, and then you create a lease here, right? What that happens is now it provides you with what is the name of this particular file that you're going to create, right? Then you put in the property address, what type of property, is it active, is it inactive, is it a prospect, so on and so forth, right? Then once you complete this, then what happens is it creates a folder for you, right? And as you can see, active folders, but you also can have pending folders as well, right? So the essence is a lot of us tend to forget and we say, "Oh my God, I just lost the file, and the file is missing, and I just spent so much time, effort, and energy." Well, at uh, you got to look at. Sorry about the background. We have a little chihuahua here. You got to look at the actual activity because sometimes you might accidentally put the file in a different category, right? It might be that you accidentally put it in pending. Maybe you accidentally put it in active, right? So you got to look at the variables of where it's at because sometimes what happens is you think you have it here because this is the main page, right? But in essence, you might have accidentally put it as a prospect, right? And now it's like, oh my gosh, thank goodness, all of my files that I created are here, right? And all you have to do is just toggle from prospect and put it back to active, and then that brings you back up to the very top. Okay, so one of those little secrets that I get so many calls on. Simon, I lost my file. You think you can help me? And I already have an idea. It's probably in a different status. Okay. All right. So then now I created the folder. For today's class, I just used lease training. Right. You're going to double click, and it's now going to provide you with all of these information. Right. It's going to tell you, and this is where you can toggle right from active, prospect, pending, closed, inactive, or it fell, right? And then it has all this other stuff. Now, remember, the core of the disclosures is what you include in this particular file, right? So in essence, when you're gathering all of the essential agreements, right, you go where it says all folders. Okay. Now you can also see where it says integrations, right? This is just a new thing that has help when it comes to tenant screening, digital advertising. This one you don't have to necessarily, but some I've seen house providers even include as part of the disclosures, they also provide a natural hazard disclosure report too as part of the initial process, right? Because in essence, even though they're not purchasing the property, it's relevant of what other known disclosures, right? If the property falls within approximately of a airport, right, a industrial location, right, or a high school or schooling, right, all of those are relevant information because I've also seen where housing providers ultimately, get everything going, the ball rolling, they accept the applicant, they draft the lease agreement, and then all of a sudden they move into the place, and then they realize, oh my gosh, I didn't know that we were so close to whatever the issue, right? If it's near an airport as an example, right? And now they're trying to break the lease. They're trying to not continue with the lease. And now the housing provider is kind of in a stuck situation. So again, not that it's one of those requirements, but it's definitely something encouraged to do is to provide any and all additional disclosures, even though it may not be specific to the property. It's still good to know what's outside of the property too, because there's constant stuff around us, right, that may impact the property. So just kind of giving you heads up on that. All right. So once you navigated and ultimately created the folder, right? Now you go into the motions of what forms you're going to include. Now, this is where I get a lot of the agents say, well, I don't know what forms to include, right? Well, in essence, the easiest and the best thing is hire a transaction coordinator. Okay. That's going to be the best thing, in my opinion, right? You're willing to pay. Well, Simon, it's a lease. I'm not going to make a lot of money. I get it and I understand. But you also don't have to worry of all of the stuff when a transaction coordinator has already bullet points of the actual folder that he or she needs in order to streamline the process, right? But again, I get it. When it comes to leases, there's really not much money involved, and it doesn't make sense to pay someone to do, the documents on your behalf or your client's behalf, right? So in essence, that's okay. So then what you do is you want to make sure that it's on the California Association of Realtors section. But here's the trick right here. Okay. It's this little section here where it says all, okay, no category, back office, commercial, disclosures, updated forms in December, and then lease, right? So if you're working with a housing provider, then you're going to click on lease. Now, what that happens is it's going to provide you with all of the lease agreements that you can get started, right? Now, in essence, the most common stuff that you should include is your cover sheet. Okay. My opinion, the cover sheet will help you tremendously because once you have the cover sheet, now you can put your client's information. And what happens is you don't have to systematically do all of the forms. It does it for you automatically, meaning that when you click on the cover sheet, as an example, right? And I'm going to click here so you get an idea. Then what happens is it creates this transaction cover sheet. The more information that you can put here, right, the easier everything is going to then incorporate or integrate into all of the documents that you have on this file. Meaning, If your client is Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, right, as the housing providers, you're going to put their information, you're going to put their address, you're going to put all of the relevant information, right? And then that's going to now populate on all of the documents. So you don't have to go one by one, adding all of the information. Now, I also want to caution you, this is not a live person. It's a computer generated, right? So it is to your advantage to go back and make sure that everything is checked, everything aligns, because there's sometimes some hurdles and hiccups when it comes to importing information. Sometimes it doesn't connect to the other folder, or excuse me, the other documents. So I would encourage you, go through all of the forms before you get it DocuSign to your clients, right? So once we complete all of this, you're going to make sure you save, okay? Because if you don't click save, what's going to happen, none of the stuff is going to be saved. So you got to also remember to constantly, any updates that you do, any changes that you do, including dates, because sometimes I see when people submit, documentation, it has a date of 4 or 5 months ago, right? And the system doesn't know what to do, what the real time is. So you want to make sure that you check even the smallest things when it comes to dates, right? And then you want to save it up here. Okay. Now, just to show you what the form looks like, right? This is for buyers and tenants. Okay. And you also want to make sure that you check this as well, because then it's easier for the consumer to see where they're going to be initialing or signatures as well. Okay. Once you complete all this, depending on who you represent, right? So we represent the landlord or the housing provider. You want to make sure that you go in this section, right? Because if you accidentally put the housing provider's information here, it's going to recognize as the tenant, not the housing provider, right? So you want to make sure that the information is here. All of the information, as much as you have, right? Even emails will help you streamline the documents a lot more easier. Okay. All right. So then once you complete all this, now, the property information too, the more information that you can put, it keeps everything in a line. It helps you navigate. And if you have any concerns or issues, you can just go back to your cover sheet. Okay. The MLS ID number is okay. The legal description, the tax ID, the parcel number, right? Not that it's going to be that relevant when it comes to, renting property, but it's good to practice moving forward with all of your files, so that way you have more of a concise build out of your transactions. So when you delegate it or you upload it to our command opportunity, we have a compliance person that handles the compliance to make sure that all of the documents, and there's a checklist too as well, right? And I'm going to also navigate later on where that checklist PDF, where you can now see exactly what documents you want. Now, for me, I already have it in my head. My checklist is up here, so I already know exactly what forms do I need, but I'm still going to cross-reference, and I'm going to check the checklist that we have for each office and make sure that whatever the checklist that is on there, it coincides to the file that I have and the forms that I have, and that all the signatures and dates are all good. Because remember, at the end of the day, when you're ready to submit for final, right, if there's any documents missing, any initials or signatures missing, dates, then they're going to kick it back. Even though the deal might have already closed and it's been leased out, you're not going to get your compensation. So I want to make sure that you're on top of it, right? And submit everything early. Don't wait till the very last minute and expect that your file is going to get approved, especially if it's late afternoon on a Friday, right? This may not be looked at to maybe the following business days, which may be Monday of the following week, right? So I encourage you to make sure that you gather all of the documentation, and this will streamline, right? Because the more information you do up front, right? Even before you even list this property on the MLS, you already have the housing providers with all of the documents that they need to sign, right? As an example, have it ready to rock and roll, right? And now you have your folder that you created. So now moving forward, when we identify a potential tenant, we already have all the paperwork. And now we're just having the agent who's helping or representing the tenant have their client sign, and then we now consume the agreement or secure the agreement itself. Okay, so I would encourage all of you, please use the transaction cover sheet. It just makes it a whole lot easier, right? And especially when you put all of your information here as well, all of your documents, it's going to have all of your information. So you don't have to do individual documentation. It's going to just go right into it, right? A lot of this stuff is not relevant on a rental, but again, start practicing, right? Start making sure that this is your number one form. Every time you create a file, you always want to include the cover sheet, okay? Because this just helps you tremendously. All right, so then once we complete the transaction, right, you can go back and make sure you save it, and you go back. It's going to take you back to the main file. Okay. So here's the list of files, or excuse me, here's the list of documents that I've already included, right? And I just went rapid fire and just started throwing everything in here, right? Because once I go to all forms, I want to make sure that I go to this section here where it says lease. Click on that. And now it's going to provide you with all of the relevant documents that are part of a lease, right? And everything is coincide together, meaning it's landlord or housing provider documentation, such as your lease listing agreement and disclosures. And it's even like your application, right? So again, it doesn't matter who you represent, you still want to create. If you represent the tenant, make sure you have a folder as the tenant representation, because there is a tenant representation agreement, right? Similar to a BRBC. There's an application that your clients are going to need to fill out in order to start the process to get approval for one of the homes, condos, or apartments, right? Um, so you want to understand, where you stand, right? So again, going back, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking that you represent the housing provider. So what I like to do, and this is just my habit, doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it, but I still go through everything, because there's so many new changes, there's so many new revisions, there's so many new forms that it seems like every 6 to a year they're replacing, revising, deleting, or modifying, right? So you want to make sure that you're on top of all this stuff. And again, as I disclosed earlier, utilize a transaction coordinator if you want. That'll help you tremendously because they should be on top of all of the updated forms as well. All right. So once you upload all of the documents, now all of this is going to be in one file, right? So the beautiful thing is the disclosures, like the water heater statement, right? If you filled out the cover sheet, then what's going to happen is all of the information is already going to be filled out, right? And it's just ready for signatures, right? Because everything that you did, 80 to 90% completed, will then transfer over to all of your forms, right? So the address will be on there, the seller, or excuse me, the housing provider's information, or even if you have the tenant's information already, right? And you're ready to secure the lease, then, it's all going to be populated, right? So here's what I encourage all of you to do. When you go to lease and you're representing the housing provider, go through all of the forms that you believe are relevant. Now, with that being said, I'm going to use KW Resource Hub as an example, and then I'm going to go to the Resource Center, right? Now, all of the market centers have their own entity. I'm just using the South Bay because it populates for me. But if you go into the resource hub and go to resource here, then click on resources here, office resources. It's going to take you to this window. Then here is where all of the information that you're going to need in order for you to now go through the motions of what documentations you need, what we call the checklist. So you go where it says office checklist right here. Okay. You click on that and it's gonna provide you with all of the PDFs that you can download, right? So then I'm gonna try to find the one that says about leases, right? Boom. I have the lease agreement. I'm going to double click on that. And now I'm going to see here are all of the relevant documentations that I need in order to complete the file in order for me to get paid my compensation, right? Now, you can download this and then put it into your folder. You can also take this and put it into your zip forms file. So that way, if you ever need to check and verify what documentations you have when it comes to what disclosures I must provide the tenant, right? There you go. You download it, you bring it, and now you create. I also would encourage you to always constantly check these checklists on the hub, because we constantly scrub and we update these checklists as well, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be changes all the time. So we want to make sure that we have the most recent documents available to you so that way you're in alignment and in compliance and your folder is completely ready to submit and get approved. So if we ever get audited by the Department of Real Estate, we have a completed file with all of the relevant documentations in place. Make sense? Okay, so here's an example of what a lease listing checklist would look, right? And you also remember you want to complete all of this within a time frame, right? So, as an example, if you represent the landlord or the housing provider, and you're securing the lease listing agreement within 72 hours of getting the document signed, you want to start the opportunity and submit everything to compliance. Within 72 hours of identifying and ultimately securing, right, a potential tenant, you want to submit additional documentation. And then within 72 hours prior to actually completing everything for final, you want to make sure that you're scrubbing your file to make sure that everything is in alignment, right? Because most of us do not use a TC, so we're relying on ourselves to be the TC, right? And make sure that I've checked all of the stuff that are relevant, because there's a lot of things in here that are not relevant to the file, right? Depending on the circumstances and the situation will determine where you stand, right? So, in essence, double check and also check with the office, check with the broker too, and say, hey, you know what? I just want to make sure, is this part of the agreement that we must include or not include, right? So, I'm going to kind of rapid fire here so you get a good understanding and in essence of what that looks like. Okay. So the checklist, right? An agency disclosure is going to be already included when you do the tenant representation agreement, right? It already attaches, so you know that that is done. So you would check it, right? I know there's a lot of agents too that'll print this and have either a blue or a red pin, and then they'll just go item by item and just check, okay, boom, I got this, got this, got this. So that way, when the file is ready to submit for final, right, you already have all of the stuff and it streamlines the process so that way there is no delay. Okay. Lease listing, right? Obviously, that's one of the most important thing is having the lease listing agreement in place, right? That gives you the authorization to start marketing the property for compensation, right? Putting it on the MLS, starting all of the paperwork that is necessary for the housing provider to start filling out to provide that to the new tenant in place. A lot of this stuff is already attached to a lot of the agreements that you populate. So you just want to make sure, well, Simon, I didn't see this document. Oh, it's in there. It's in there, right? And you'll see that as long as you do like the lease listing agreement, it populates all of these other advisories. So you just want to make sure, oh, here it is. There's the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory. It's already attached, right? So boom, you check that off. Rental property owners disclosures, right? Modification of terms, if there is any modifications to be done. Lease rental commission agreement, okay? Part of the lease listing agreement. Remember, there is no compensation provided when a tenant is being represented by the agent, right? So we want to make sure that, everything aligns, and more so, is the housing provider going to compensate an agent who brings a ready and willing and able applicant to the table, and you ultimately get this deal done, right? Lease rental commission agreements, broker compensation agreement, if it's applicable. So it also references if it's relevant or not, right? Tenant representation agreement, which is a requirement. We're going to ask for a copy of the MLS printout. And if the property never hits, and I get this question quite often is, well, Simon, what if we never put it on the MLS? How do we provide a MLS printout? Well, you don't. Okay, you never put it on the MLS, but we're going to need something in writing that says that the housing provider instructed us never to put it on the MLS, right? And it's just either an email that is coming from the housing provider, or you have something in writing that they instructed you not to put it on the MLS, and that's perfectly fine because that again is instructions from the housing provider or even the tenant on telling us what we need to do. Um, the property profile, you can pull that information from the MLS, applications, the rental lease agreement, so on and so forth. So, in essence, I really want to dive into really today's topic is really the disclosures, right? Because the disclosures um, can be far and few than your typical residential sale, right? So it starts right here where you can see number 14. This is where most of the disclosures are at. The lead-based paint. If the property was built prior to 1978, then you must include that as part of the documents. You still need to provide the environmental lead-based and earthquake disclosure. We live in the state of California, and as much as we love earthquakes, we have them every once in a while, right? So this is more for consumers that don't know or have never lived in California or relocating from other states that don't have earthquakes, right? They might have tornadoes, they might have snow, so they're not used to it. So we want to fully disclose to them the reason behind this particular property that is here in Southern California, that it divulges and it discloses to the consumers, hey, you know what, we live in a state that there is active activity when it comes to shakes, right? So we're just being very relevant on that. Tenant flood hazard disclosure. This is why it's really good to also include the NHD report, because it is a concern, especially when we had the heavy rains, right? Let's say a property was up in the mountains, such as Big Bear, right? And then there was a flash flood, right? And now the house, right, that they rented now is in 2 feet of water, right? So we want to be relevant because a tenant may say, I wouldn't have rented this place if I would have known that this was a concern. And you, housing providers, knew this. Now all of my personal belongings are ruined, right? So again, just to be transparent, full disclosure, we're providing all of the concerns regarding the property, right? People will still rent regardless, right? Because what are the probabilities that a property, especially in Southern California, right, will have those type of situations? Well, it happens, but it doesn't happen that often, like properties in Florida, as an example, back east, right? But again, full disclosures. If the property had any legal substance, right, in the past 3 years, if a tenant that the housing provider did not know was doing a lab there, right? We have to disclose that for the sake of hazard situations, because if the tenant finds out by a neighbor, hey, did you know that this property there was, issues with drugs and paraphernalia, people were coming in and out, right? That may be a concern and a liability that now the tenant may go after the housing provider or even the real estate agent if we knew or had some indicators that in the past we had some really sketchy people, unfortunately, living in the place, right? And just full transparency, you're just providing all of the disclosures if you know if that was the case, right? You have to disclose anyone that has occupied the property within the last 3 years. Death on the property too. No difference than part of the SPQ. It's wrong. Well, Simon, it's a rental for crying out loud. Why do we need to provide a death? Well, because people are superstitious. At the end of the day, people may not feel comfortable if someone passed away by natural causes or something else, right? So the essence is, asking the right questions, and the housing provider is going to sign these documentations, and there's going to be specific questions asked by the documents that we're going to provide if the housing provider is aware of certain disclosures that must be provided, such in this case, if there was a death that occurred. Copy of tenant deposit, rent checks, and all that. Again, most people are streamlining by wiring money. You still want to get some type of invoice or paperwork for paper trail and full transparency. Any addendums that were provided as part of the negotiations. I see a lot of attachments, especially on the lease agreement. There's additional addendums and language that the housing provider is requesting as part of the agreement, right? I've seen some really intense agreements, and I've seen some not so intense, right? Depending on the housing provider and their experience, right? I've seen where housing providers or attorneys own residential investment properties, but they want to cover all bases, and they have all of these items that they're requesting from the tenant to sign before they actually allow them to rent the place, right? So all of these documents are relevant to completing the file. Any extensions and so on and so forth, path addendum. If the client is requesting, you know, or allows, I should say, any pets, right? Then there's an addendum that the tenant and the landlord must sign. If there's a pool, if there's a hot tub, there's a specific addendum on the cautious and requirements that all responsible parties need to sign. Megan's Law, no difference than a residential sales, right? Any sex offenders, and the unfortunate aspect is public information, right? They can just go to the website, type in the subject property address, and it's going to give you all of the registered sex offenders in the neighborhood. Again, for peace of mind, we just don't want a tenant to come back and says, "Well, I wouldn't have rent this place if I knew there was a sex offender next door to me," right? So in essence, we've divulged and disclosed everything to them. It is their job and their duty to do their responsibility and research and find out, right? Because most people rent before they purchase, right? Most people want to check out the neighborhood before they purchase. Most want to go into a specific city because they want to go into the city for the reason of their children's school, so they start in that momentum. They may not be able to afford, but at least they live in the city where now allows their children to go to a specific school that they wish to go to. So there's many variables for that, or even location from work too. Okay, that's the beautiful thing about renting. All right, let me answer a couple questions here. Pa, pa, pa. How much does a TC charge for a lease? Good question. I believe RTC, and I can be wrong, I can find out, but I believe it's $50, $50 to do a lease for our office, but I'm not sure for the other offices because it's very limited paperwork. But I've seen either 50 to $100 to do all of the paperwork and upload everything on your behalf to be in compliance. Okay, but I can double check. Someone said $250. Okay, that might be the case for certain TCs, but nothing surprises me, right? There's more paperwork and all that. And see, the problem is most leases, there's really not much money. Okay, your average compensation, right, when representing a tenant or representing a housing provider, it's usually a percentage of the total income that comes in from the year. Meaning, if you charge, as an example, $5,000 for rent, you times that by 12, that puts $60,000. And if you're the agent representing the housing provider and you say, I want to charge you 3%, where you're getting a percentage of the total revenue that comes in within that 1 year. Meaning that if you do the arithmetic at 3% at $60,000, you're making $1,800. And remember, when you're representing the tenant, right? The tenant is responsible to pay you compensation, but we're going to throw it at the housing provider to see if the housing provider will pay us. And if the housing provider doesn't pay us, then we can then go to the tenant and ask the tenant to pay us our compensation. Okay. So, and both can pay as well too. The tenant can pay and the housing provider, right? Just depends on what your tenant representation agreement shows. If you show 3% as a represented the tenant, you submit a request of 3%, and the listing agent comes back and says, we will not do 3%, but we'll do 2%, and you agree to it, you can still collect the amount offset of the difference that the tenant is responsible to pay. Has no difference in a purchase, right? So if you put 3%, they come back at 2%. There's a 1% discrepancy. Well, the seller, or excuse me, the housing provider can pay you the 2%, and you can still ask the tenant to pay you the difference of 1% for a total of 3%. Or you can squash it and say, look, I'm okay just taking the 2%. I am not going to charge you the additional 1%. We're good. I want you to be happy, because remember, these tenants will eventually become, in the future, possible homeowners, right? And they're building momentum. They're saving up their money, or they're just waiting for the right opportunity. And you want to be in that forefront of that conversation when they're ready to buy, right? Or on the flip side, right? On the flip side, you represent the tenant, excuse me, the housing provider as well, right? And by representing the housing provider, maybe in the near future, they may decide, look, I'm done. I don't want to become a landlord anymore. I'm done. I want to sell this property and ultimately do a 1031 exchange and then buy something totally different. Right? And that might be the case too, as well. So again, there's benefits in who you represent. What is the pet deposit rule, and how much can the housing provider ask for, right? Well, I get mixed information on this, and you know, uh, the issue is it really depends, right? It really depends. Some will say and some will argue that you cannot ask no more for pet deposit. Okay. But you can ask for a deposit that coincides, meaning, okay. And, the rule of the thumb may be a little different. I'm not an expert when it comes to property management, but what I hear is that you cannot ask for pet deposit, even though you're putting pet deposit in there. It has to coincide and be incorporated into the actual deposit. Meaning, okay, if the rental is $5,000, okay, that's the deposit. That's also if you're allowing your client is allowing pets, then let's say that it's $500 for that. So if it's $5,000 deposit, right? Because you can ask for a deposit, okay, plus first month's rent, 5,000, but you're also allowing pets and you're asking for $500 of pet deposit, then that 5,000 now becomes 4,500 as security deposit and 500 as pet deposit for a total of $5,000. You cannot not ask for 5,000 in additional $500 for a total of 5,500. That's what my interpretation is, that you have to incorporate that amount into the deposit. Okay. It's not added, it's incorporated into the pet deposit, right? So, in essence, when you're speaking with your clients, be very crystal clear in those conversations because I've seen in the past it was fine, and I would see $1,000, in addition to their deposit, and pets will be pets and they'll damage, right? They'll cause some concerns and issues, right? So I understand, but I can be wrong, and I'm admitting that every year there's a new change, new rules and regulations. So usually I get some of my information from some of the agents that are property managers that are on top of the rules and regulations. So just keep that in mind. Um, are the agents paid the percentage upfront or on a monthly? Very good question. So the percentage is paid at the successful lease of the property. Once the land housing provider, landlord, and the tenant come to an agreement, they sign an executed lease. The tenant now pays the first and the deposit, exchanges the monetary to the housing provider. Then from there, you are paid the percentage of the total annual income. As I mentioned, if we were to do the arithmetic, $1,800, if you got that amount accepted, then the office would collect $1,800, and then your commission split would be from that. And if you use a transaction coordinator, right, then the amount will come out of that. Now, with that being said, all right, this is the beautiful thing about documentations and forms is you can have your tenant and your landlord pay your TC, meaning that you as a agent representing the tenant can say as part of the process and business, I hire a transaction coordinator who will provide you with all of the documentation, either on a zip file or sometimes they use this, what do they call them, where you connect it to the USB with all of the forms already for future reference, right? So the tenant would be responsible to pay the TC, as long as you document it when you're consulting them in the very beginning before out there showing homes. They are under the understanding they're signing that they agree, right, that they are going to be responsible to pay your transaction coordinator. And that's perfectly fine to do so. On the flip side to that as well, folks, that also goes on a housing provider. You can have the housing provider pay your TC as part of the agreement as well, right? So they would be responsible. So your full commission would not be deducted from the TC fee. Does that make sense? Okay, so provide. All right, so the next question from Emilio is what is the rules around housing providers providing pictures of move in and move out? Good question. Good question. So now there's a new regulations that I'm going to go back that I'm going to show you that I think it's really relevant is on the and does everyone on Zoom see my computer?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So when it comes to the move in, move out form, uh, you have what's called a pre-move out and a move out inspection, right? So on this, I'm going to use the pre-move out inspection as an example. And it says the following, okay? The tenants in place, the property address, if it's a unit, all of the relevant information. You have an opportunity to remedy the identified deficiency prior to the termination of the tenancy. However, you may do so only in a manner consistent with the rights and obligations, right? So, you can provide the additional stuff if there is anything that, the tenant will take care of. Now, with that being said, Emilio, part of now the requirement is that a housing provider should take photos prior to the tenant, moving in, and then once the tenant decides to vacate, you also want to take photos for documentation because we've seen in the past uh, small claims lawsuits where the tenants are rebuting that they damaged the property. Okay, that the property was already in the same condition. So what you want, before we used to just document it. Now what I would encourage all of you to do, and hold that thought, Emilio, is this. You want to, if you're the agent, okay, representing the housing provider, you want to make sure that you're videotaping everything, right? Or taking photos of everything, or a combination of both, right? You're walking more or less like a final walkthrough, right? And making sure when you do your admin, as an example, you want to make sure so that way you're documenting how the property looks prior to the tenant. And if there's something that is there, right, you document it, you provide that, and now, when the tenant is doing their inspections, they're going to say, okay, so that is there. It's no difference than when renting a vehicle. How many people have rented a vehicle, right? What happens is when you sign the agreement, you're responsible, right, for anything that happens to that vehicle, right? They first and foremost ask you, do you have insurance, or would you like us to provide you with that extra coverage, right? And then at the end, once you sign the agreement, you walk out to the vehicle, what do? You do a physical inspection of the vehicle to make sure that you and the rental place are both on the same page, right? Because you don't want to drive out there, you missed, they missed, and it had a huge dent that the previous rental did not disclose it, was under the radar, right? And no one caught it. And then you're responsible when you return the vehicle because they're going to do a final walkthrough as well. And they're going to say, well, there's a dent here. Well, I didn't do that, right? So this is the reason you want to make sure you do that same thing when it comes to, renting a place. Is you do a walkthrough, you take photos, and when the tenant vacates. Emilio, you had a question, sir.
Hey, Simon, no, I think you answered it. So we would be responsible, the agent would be responsible for doing the video pictures when we first meet with the client to take on the,
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah. Because part of the responsibility is that you want to make sure that you're taking care of your client's best interest, right? And part of your responsibility is if you're going to be listing a property for lease, then I would encourage you no difference than the responsibility of actually doing an AVID, right? Your agent visual inspection. It's part of our requirements and responsibility. Now, all of this information is going to be now passed on. You can either send the client an email with a folder with all of the images that you taken, or in return, right? They can provide you as well. So it's a two-way street, Emilio, meaning you can do it or your clients could. But I would feel more comfortable if I did it because now you're checking every element of it, right? Now, remember, just for full transparency, too, is we're not in the property management, right? So we're not going to property manage, right? Because first and foremost, we don't have insurance to cover you if someone then tries to come back and try to, sue, right? We don't have E&O insurance that covers us for that purpose. So I caution you, if you're doing property management, you want to delegate it to the your clients to find and identify someone that does property management. Now, also full disclaimer: if you own your own properties, you can property manage your own investment properties with no problem, right? You own them, you have insurance,
Mhm.
and you can definitely do property management.
Quick
The
question, Simon.
the housing provider, yes.
Yes, sorry about that. Quick question. So is there those, so you would recommend the email going to the client with the attached files would be enough, or do we also upload it into command for compliance?
I would first give it to the housing provider, your clients first, who will get the approval. And then part of your file, yeah, because we just never know. You may represent them on the lease, right? And you identify and you found a great tenant. They live there happily, and then 2 years later, you get a letter from an attorney's firm, right, saying, "Hey, there's a situation here between the parties involved, and you were the agent at the time 2 years prior that had documentation, right? So they may subpoena you to provide additional documentation. So that's why you do definitely want to provide all that as part of your command and upload it for the sake of transparency, but more so to protect you from future claims that may arise at a later date. You have all of that file, right? And all of that file includes your photos, your videos, in your emails, your back and forth text messages, anything and everything. Remember, the more, the better, right? Yes, it's a nuisance, and it's like it's a lease. But I've seen so many cases, guys, where we see so many tenants, sue the landlords and drag the agents into this, right? More so, the Section 8 thing is the one of the biggest things. So, you know, I caution anyone that has listings that are for rent. You get a lot of calls that are asking, and they're decoys, and they're trapping you to say that no, we don't accept Section 8. Remember, the best and the safest way is we accept all applications. Please submit your applications, and all of that information will be provided to the housing provider for further evaluation and approval. And leave it at that. You're in compliance, you did what you needed to do, and then now you're not getting a letter or someone serving you that you compromised and violated, the Section 8 stuff. So just be very careful. And a lot of the disclosures, right, do provide with the extra layer of additional protection for not just the consumers, right, your housing providers, your tenants, but also the agents involved in it. So this is why I would urge all of you, make sure that you get all of the documentations that you need, because that's going to help you in case this ever comes back to haunt us, that we have, a completed form done, right? So here's the pre-move out inspection statement, as part of the process. And you're not necessarily going to be involved in this, right? Because your job ends the minute that the agreement is executed, right? The lease, the month-to-month agreement is done. This is more, again, for someone that is doing property management, running the property management aspects. Because remember, even this form at the very bottom, I believe, let me take a quick look. It actually doesn't. All right, so even better. I thought, yeah, okay, so oh yeah, CC right here. Your information on all of the documents is stapled, meaning that an attorney is going to know who drafted this agreement, even though you were not involved in it, right? So there's certain things you got to understand, that if you're going to be part of it, you may be dragged into a potential litigation when it comes to these documentation. Now, again, something like this, it's just not going to happen that you're going to be liable, right? But this is something that you can establish a conversation with the housing provider, saying, look, here's something that you want to document, for the sake of full transparency, because at the end, most tenants argue and fight over their earnest deposit. The house is left in the same condition that I ultimately moved into, right? And we know wear and tear is, some of the factors, right? But tenants believe that they should get their full deposit back, right? So you want to document everything. And I want to say document everything, that's more of the housing provider, right? Your job when it comes to the disclosures is to provide everything to the tenant so the tenant cannot come back and say, hey, the housing provider didn't provide me with this, the agent didn't provide me with this, and now we're in a compromised position and someone is going to have to pay for damages, right? One of the biggest ones too that I see quite often is mold. Mold is another big factor, right? And we see cases after cases of mold. So just be very careful. There is also a form there for mold as well. So just again, full transparency of all of the documentations. Now, my opinion, and this is just strictly my opinion, doesn't have any face value. I prefer not to do any leases. Okay, one, it's time consuming. There's just too much additional paperwork for the amount that you're going to get. I rather just refer it and have something in writing that says that if you refer it to another agent and that tenant decides to buy in the future, that tenant is my client in the future, right? And be done with it. Again, that's just my opinion. But sometimes we got to do what we need to do. And if leases are the only thing coming your way, then I get it. And you got to do what you got to do because that's still extra income coming your way. And I know there's a lot of agents that do really, really well when it comes to leases, right? Because they don't do your $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 properties. They do 10, 15, 20, $30,000 properties, right? So when you do the math, the higher the amount, the more commission you get. And I've seen circumstances where rentals are kind of like a regular commission, 15, $20,000 commissions, right, depending on the price point. But again, just for the sake of full transparency, the more documentation, and I would also encourage all of you, right, to really understand all of the forms, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts with all of the forms that we have, and it's hard to keep everything intact, right? I would also say, go to associations that provide additional training as well. The Los Angeles, or it's called the Greater Los Angeles of Apartment Association. They have memberships there as well, but they also have free classes. If you want to niche into doing more leases, niche into working with more tenants, you want to make sure you're in the forefront and updated with all of the legalities and form. But for today's class, as we close it out, again, feel free to reach out to me. Here's just the tip of the iceberg of some of the forms that are going to be included as part of the lease process when representing either party, right? If you represent the tenant, right, we're expecting that the agent, right, provide all of the information. Now we have no control, and our hands are tied, right? That if that particular brokerage doesn't provide all of the necessary documents, does that mean that we are responsible to add the additional? The answer is no. Okay, no, we don't represent the housing provider. We only represent the tenant, right? But if you feel that there's something relevant that the listing agent might have failed or not provide, bring it to their attention, right? Maybe they're handling. Maybe it's a new agent that doesn't know the process, and you're just extending a helping hand and saying, look, I think it's important. The house was built prior to 78. We need to provide the lead based disclosure, right? We're all here to help one another and to make our lives a lot easier, right? Because it's easier to work with people that are hard workers and just the communication is good, and it's just the goal is to get to the finish line. Okay. With that being said, that concludes our class today. Any final questions before we close out? None whatsoever.
Simon,
Is
I have
everyone?
one.
Yes.
Is there a link to which we can find a written instruction of all this documents and everything that you've taught us? I mean, like the procedures that we need to follow.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the checklist you can go through your resource hub, right? This is one. Now, the other recommendation is like if you go to the apartment, let's see, Association of Realtors. I'm just doing resources. Here's a great membership. Not that I'm asking or saying or vouching for this company, but sometimes they definitely provide information and resources about the local rental, right? Now, also, Dennis Block, 123 Eviction, I think it's, he has a lot of great stuff on his website. So is it Evictions 123 or is it 123 Evictions? Let me see. Hold on. Evictions 123. Yeah, here it is. If you go to this website, type it up, it's called evict123.com. Okay. I've had Dennis Block come and speak at our sales meetings. He has a lot of podcasts and, has a lot of information on tenant evictions and all that stuff. So I would encourage you go to his website, check out because he has a lot of stuff that he sends out to as well. Forms, the process. And this is again more geared to evictions, not necessarily, tenants and all that, but it's also good to have all of this information because let's just say that someone reaches out to you and says, hey, can you provide me with a lease agreement, but they don't want to use your services, they just want to lease. Well, your car forms are copyright protected and are only for member services, but you can also download all of this information and pass it on to the client saying, hey, I cannot give you because I don't represent you and I don't want to be named in a lawsuit when I never got compensated, but here's a website that you can do a little bit of research, and I believe that you can also download residential lease agreements and direct them to these websites. All California stuff, so it's relevant to our our state, and they have all of these additional information, pamphlets here on lead base, rental lease requirements, right? A lot of the stuff again, start building your little muscle of all of the information if you're going to go in that direction. Here's a prime example of rental lease requirements in accordance with the California lease law, right? Application process. All adults 18 and older must complete a rental application. Income requirements. Gross monthly income must be at least three times the rent. Credit history, right? A credit check will be conducted in all applicants. Applicants must demonstrate satisfaction and credit history. Rental history, background check, Section 8. We welcome Section 8 applicants. Please note that we will not rely solely on your credit report as your ability to pay is essential. Occupants guidelines, right? So it's great information. I would encourage you dive into this, get familiar. A lot of the stuff, when it comes to mold, here it is. Okay. Notice of a change of terms of moisture and mold, right? A full disclosure that you're providing, right? Again, when it comes to tenants, direct them to these, because we're not experts. If you're representing the housing provider, send them to these websites and get them acquainted, because then all of the liability doesn't fall on you; it falls on the actual client. Make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Simon, what was the
Yes.
gentleman's name for this website? Dennis? What?
Yeah,
What's his
it's
last
Dennis
name?
Block. Dennis Block.
Block.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let me go back. Yeah, Dennis Block right here. I believe he also has a podcast. Yeah, so if you go to his podcast, all of the good stuff, tenant scans, he has lots of great information. I would encourage you, go in. I might have him come in and talk at one of our sales meeting in the near future. He is a busy guy. He is a full-blown attorney, and he comes in with a lot of valuable information. But again, I would encourage you to do some research. Not that I'm just promoting Dennis Block. There's a lot of great attorneys out there, but I'm just being resourceful, right? So I hope that kind of helps. With that being said, any final questions before